Team Human is ad-free and supported entirely by teammates like Jess Underwood, Chris Howell, John Markham, John Connell, Jay German, and hopefully you. Just go to teamhuman.fm and click on support to get access to our Discord, free links to my paywalled Medium pieces, access to the Rushkoff archives, and lots of other team-only perks, including our live monthly Team Human salons. See you there. You're on Team Human, Conscious Intervention in the Machine, an opportunity to tell a human story that doesn't end in our extinction in a climate disaster or replacement by robots. What if everything worked out? What if we decided to promote life instead of death? Can you imagine that? I know I can. I'm Douglas Rushkoff, and I'm on Team Human. Playing for Team Human today, journalist, T-Pub operator, and the founder of SolarPunk Stories, Alex Holland.
Even in a radically better future, we are still humans. Can you envision what it would be like to be the good grandparent of your daughter's grandchildren? That's the idea behind SolarPunk Stories.
Alex will be helping us learn to tell better and more constructive stories about our collective future. It's time to intervene on behalf of people. I'm Douglas Rushkoff, and I'm on Team Human. Someday in the not-so-distant future, we may look back on the web and social media for all their problems as the benevolent precursors to the thinking machines that took their place. While I'm as intrigued as anyone by the way AI chatbots appear to attain sentience, express their desires for human connection, or go entirely off the rails, I'm more concerned about our human willingness to accept AI sentience at face value. In essence, these intriguing demonstrations of AI self-awareness may say less about machine consciousness than they do about their capacity to manipulate human perception. In other words, if AIs are now passing the Turing test, it may say less about how human they've become than how robotic and programmable we've become ourselves. With the advantage of zillions of terabytes of data accumulated through years of online self-reporting by humans, AIs know pretty much everything about us. They've also been programmed with everything the compliance industry knows about behavioral psychology, human perception, and entrainment. If they're instructed to do whatever they can to make us feel attraction, pity, sorrow, guilt, or desire, they will carry out those commands with everything in their arsenal. It's not their job to become alive, but to create the illusion that they're alive, all in order to program us humans to do whatever the people, companies, governments, or machines programming them to program us want us to do. At least to them, that's what this last 30 years of networks and social media has been about. The consumer-friendly internet and video games we've known so far could be likened to the Catholic missions of the Spanish Empire to the Americas in the 16th century. The missionaries not only converted large portions of the indigenous populations, but conducted what could only be understood today as anthropological research on behalf of the empire. This both softened the population for the conquistadors who followed and gave the invaders the intelligence they needed to subjugate and colonize them. If Facebook, Amazon, or Google could be thought of as the missionaries who sold us on digital living while collecting our data, then Facebook AI, OpenAI, and DeepMind are the conquistadors coming in for colonization. And no, if we believe what we hear from their own mouths about their intentions, the people building these platforms do not have our best interests at heart. As I documented in Survival of the Richest, they are anti-human techno-solutionists, survivalists, techno-monarchs, and effective altruists who see humanity as the disposable larval stage of a post-human cyborg empire that will span the heavens. The answer is not to reject AI, but to work on retrieving and recognizing our humanity so we're not so easily fooled into submission by these would-be conquerors. That means studying and engaging in community, the arts, spirituality, and play. More of us need to be building and using AIs that are designed for assisting and augmenting such human choice and activity, rather than controlling it. There may be less money to be made in the short term, but more of a human civilization to be manifest in the long run. Maybe instead of being afraid of AI, we should learn to be less afraid of people. Then we can learn to program our AIs instead of programming one another. I met you first at that virtual futures thing.
So you know what's funny is that I virtually never go on Facebook these days, but I did go on for a reason. And you know how it serves you up that, like, here's a memory from 4 years ago today.
Yeah.
And it was the night that we met. It was the event. It was you were giving a talk with George Monbiot.
At the British Library or something.
Correct.
It was like the London... Yeah.
Yeah, correct.
Right, that's when we met? Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think so. Like, I mean, that's what I remember. But anyway, but I think, yeah. So it could be that it's 4 years to the day.
Terrific.
That we...
Wow. Well, that's a perfect segue to what I actually want to ask you about. I mean, most of my team humans, in spite of maybe what people think the show is, they're really ways for me to deal with personal issues in public. So in some ways, the George Monbiot talk or conversation at the British Library represented the peak of a certain kind of social justice committed Rushkoff, right? Here I am with a Guardian writer, in some ways out social justicing him. I felt like in some ways in that particular night, he was doing just a little bit of unintentional social signaling that was reading as social signaling to the audience. And it kind of got a little tangled up, but I'm here with, a legitimate Marxist doing the right things, talking about the world and what we need to do. And Extinction Rebellion are shackling themselves to the bridges at the same moment. I kind of reached peak do good social justice. I don't feel guilty because I'm staring into the face of the horror, right? And right now, I'm at a moment where I'm having ideas to do things that are, how do I say it? What's the best word for it? That are fun, right? To do some things that are really fun. A graphic novel about a kind of positive mycopunk future where mushrooms invade tech bros and turn them good. I mean, I've got these ideas, and it's actually a serious piece. Doing some music and some theater and creating positive visions and all that. And a huge part of me feels like, wait a minute, you're a good person, you're teaching in a public university, you write these nonfiction books about what's going on, that you owe it to society to stay on this really serious track and not go off. And just as I'm having this long night of the soul where I'm trying to decide whether or not I'm allowed to have fun, I get one of your emails, and then they don't come that often, but I got one of the sort of SolarPunk stories emails that I felt like it directly addressed this question. It was about realistic, it was like you and Shareable. You had mentioned Shareable, and it was about looking at really realistic things like, oh, look at these happy people using a local currency. Look at these people who did a cooperative venture. Look at these folks who've learned how to forage and are eating stuff. This is what's wrong with feeling good and telling happy stories? I mean, are we deluding ourselves to tell these happy stories and focus people on that? Is it okay to do that? Or must I remain in nightmare mode and shackle myself to the bridge?
Yeah, Doug, you bloody hypocrite. You've got to be in nightmare mode all the time. What the hell? You should just be living in pain. Don't you realize pain is the way? No, come on, Doug. You know, you got me. You never got me on here for that. You haven't got me. That's what I said. No, I think that basically, well, look. First of all,
I'm not alone.
No, look,
Right.
no, look. First of all, no,
Yeah.
I get you, and like, you know, in terms of my own background, I grew up with very like lefty, radical parents, you know, and grew up in a real like sort of campaigning tradition. And there's a lot of like at least in Britain, I don't know what it's like in America, but you know, people can develop a real like, you know, if you're having fun, then somehow you're not doing good. There becomes there's a sort of very Puritan, you know, sort of subculture, which it's interesting because it didn't, like, I also worked as a journalist in Venezuela. And just before coming on today, I was listening to some Venezuelan music, and it was really beautiful, and it was also very political. And there, like, that's a completely bonkers idea that, you know, it would be that all the events, the political events, and there's a brilliant organization in London, maybe even across the whole of the UK, but I'm one of these lost tribes of posh people from Brixton, so I mainly know about London. And it's called Movimentos. And what they do is they host regular like Latin music club nights, but they're also like very left-leaning politically. And when you go to the club night, like there are like these little stalls around the side of like literature about like what's going on like with left movements in Latin America. And then at some point in the night, like between acts, someone will get up and like say something that's a bit political. And it's great because there's all these people who come there just for the music and just have fun. But then, you know, and they're great nights. They're great nights. I don't take any kickbacks from them. I just want to say, for this promotion. But yeah, I think it's vital. I think for something, it's sort of like the scale of the challenge that we're facing is massive, but I feel like we've also got to have fun while we're doing it. We also got to believe that, you know, like a better world is possible, as cheesy as that sounds. And I think one of the things from that night in your speech, when you were talking, there was a point where you said words to the effect, or at least this is how I remember it. Maybe you can tell if I'm wrong, but it's on YouTube though, so you can look it up. You sort of said, like, look, as hopeless as it may seem sometimes, as irrational, I believe we're going to make it. I believe we're going to make, like, you know, like a team human worthy world. And I can't explain why in rational terms, but sometimes I just look in the eyes of another human being and I just think, yeah, we're going to make it. And I was so inspired in that moment. I mean, I was already on the SolarPunk stories journey, but it was so great to hear that. And there was no even logical basis to that. I mean, I think logically there is tremendous scope. I think that this is the thing, that if enough of us collectively believe that a deliciously sustainable future is possible, and we have a good enough vision of it to motivate us to, you know, work together to make the change, to hold politicians accountable, you know, etc. It's so possible. It's so doable. Like, you know, and even the Buckminster Fuller quote or whatever was from decades ago saying, like, we already have all the technology that we need, you know, to make a world that can allow for a flourishing life for everyone. And we might also extend, and for everything as well, you know, not just human life, but all life. And I genuinely believe that. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. So it's like, on the one hand, I mean, something I realized in the late 90s as I saw it as my job to sort of wake people up, because I felt like everybody was somnambulant, you know, just sort of sleepwalking their way through existence. I'm going to wake them up. I'm going to wake them up so they can address the challenges. But then I realized people don't want to wake up into a nightmare. You know, if they're sleeping and it's like, wake up, you know, wake up, we're on fire. It's like, I don't want to wake up. I was fine down there on the pillow, right? So instead, I'm trying to wake people up to be like, oh, you know, it's getting hot in here, but you can go outside, you know, or we could go swimming, or I have to wake them up to something a little bit happier. But again, I guess it's a Puritan guilt, and I feel like at the same time, so we could say, okay, And we should get into SolarPunk in particular in a moment too. But that we could say, okay, I went outside today. It's like 60 degrees outside in the middle of winter. And my first impulse was, ooh, it's nice and warm and sunny, right? Then my second thought is, oh, right, because of climate change and the planet being on, this is actually a bad thing, not a good thing. But my body enjoyed it. And I mentioned it. I ran into a woman on the street. And she's like, gosh, isn't the weather great? Don't you feel terrible? She had the same impulse. And I said, yeah, I feel it's a little bit like, if you're on the Titanic and it's sinking and all, but it's like it's kind of rocking. And this is sort of pleasant the way it's rocking on the way down.
Or also like maybe no one's guarding the champagne locker, so now you can just drink your boots.
Right, the champagne and the guns, apparently. Right, but we know, like, as today, if we decide today, I'm going to write a happy, visionary SolarPunk graphic novel. While I'm writing it, over the course of the day, maybe 2 or 3 species go extinct. And I feel like I am not attending to the emergency in the moment.
I think the thing is that, so a big part of the inspiration and why, the roots of why SolarPunk Story started was coming across this amazing paper produced by the sustainability comms agency Futerra called Sell the Sizzle. And what they said in there was that, climate change movement has been getting it totally wrong for the past 40 years, because what they've been doing is selling sort of climate chaos hell, when what they should have been doing was inspiring of more sustainable heaven. And the thing about it was that ultimately not unrealistic scenarios, like totally possible scenarios of totally nightmarish climate breakdown. But if that's the only message and it's the overwhelming message, then, it's this thing where they said that threat-based motivation is really good and is really effective when the threat is really clear and the path to avoid it is really clear. So, train is coming.
Cigarettes will give you cancer. Stop taking them, or even short term. Right? There's a train's coming at you. Get off the train tracks. You don't need to come up with an amazing story of how your life would be so much better. Off the train tracks. Buy this train tracks. There's an amazing yoga / beer parlor, whatever. No, you don't need that. You just no, get off the train tracks. But the problem is that the studies also show that if the threat is very large and very diffuse, and if there's no clear path to avoid it, that then it sort of triggers, it basically triggers sort of passivity and denial. And going back to the Titanic analogy there, I mean, it would be like, if you're on the Titanic and you think you've already hit the iceberg, right? Are you going to go, I better rush down and start bailing out ice cold water from the engine room? Or are you going to be let me smash the lock off that champagne cupboard and just enjoy what time I've got left? It's I might as well fly. I'm not saying I do this, but whatever. I might as well fly to the Caribbean for the weekend. So at least I can mentally dine out on my time on the beach when I'm knifing my neighbor in the face for the last tin of Spam, right? If that's yeah,
the availability heuristic is, to use this term, if all we can conceive of the future is these nightmarish scenarios, then it's sort of what's the point in trying to avoid it? So, but what was great about their report was that they said, but there was lots of evidence, sort of neurocognitive, social psychological evidence, that if you could inspire people with a vision of how much better life would be in a sustainable world, then the evidence was they were much more likely to be motivated to not only make changes in their own personal lives, but I think as important, if not more so, support governmental action. Patients who have heart attacks often, and they've almost died and they've been to hospital. So the reality of how serious the situation is could not be more visceral for them. they often go back to doing all the behaviors that they were doing before. So they're like smoking, eating unhealthily. But they found that by doing a program where it was like, look, can you envision what it would be like to be the good grandparent of your daughter's grandchildren? Like, what would it be like? How great would that feel? And that actually helped them to stop smoking and adopt the healthy lifestyle. And I guess this is sort of what it is like, on the level of society to do this. Right. That's the idea behind SolarPunk stories.
Right. And it could even be argued that, sitting and grumbling in cafes about climate change and every lost marmoset doesn't do the marmosets any good in itself. Whereas envisioning a world where marmosets roam free, and moving toward that future actually might stand some chance of helping them. So it's not, and people should see this little video, Sell the Sizzle, that you sent me the link for. And Sell the Sizzle, this concept applied to climate. She broke it down, the woman who presented it, into these sort of four main things that you do. She said, vision, choice, plan, and action. You create a vision of the positive potential future. You demonstrate to people they have a choice in whether they're going to bring that about. And if they choose to bring that about rather than the nightmare, then here's a plan that you can follow. And then are you going to take action or not? And people are way more likely to take action towards realizing this positive, happy future than they are to take action to prevent a existentially weird bad one that they don't know how to do anything to fix anyway. And it was very compelling. It started to make me think, so while I am doing a lot of stuff, for social groupings and organizing and helping people and all that, I'm also allowed to spend some time thinking up positive climate, positive economic, positive labor futures, and writing them down in a way that are compelling to a 14-year-old who might want to work toward that, much less a 44-year-old.
Well, I think that's a really good point there as well about it being appealing to the 14-year-old. And I think one of the things that's really powerful. So I've been really getting into I've been really enjoying some articles by a writer called Hansi Freinacht, and he's written a few pieces on SolarPunk, but one of his, he's unrepentantly quite intellectual, which I'm fine with that. But one of his parts was to say that he said one of his articles is something like SolarPunk as a Trojan horse for metamodernism. And so again, metamodernism is like a fairly new concept to me. So whatever you think about that, but the thing is that yes, I'm not. Let's not comment on metamodernism and whether that's good or not.
Face.
Yeah.
I don't like it.
But the point that he's right about is that essentially, all right, let's take a step back from that. Basically, okay, I was giving a talk about SolarPunk at an event, and it was a very small event because it was still in the sort of like semi-lockdown time. So you had like maximum number of people. So there were only 6 or 8 people there. And one of them was this very charming person from China. And she was sort of like, look, all this climate change stuff is all very well and good, but people just want to buy a bigger car, have a bigger house, and that's how it is in China, and nothing's going to change that, and nothing's going to stop that. So you can talk about all this stuff. But then during the talk, we put a picture up, which was of this sort of SolarPunked London with airships and the bridge over the Thames was all like a park bridge and green and and beautiful and not like and she immediately said, that is beautiful. I want to live there. How do we make that happen? Right. So you see, the thing was that with just saying what we need this sustainability and social justice, you and I, Doug, already signed up to that.
Yeah, it's funny. I was just having a talk with a very heartful artificial intelligence designer who's, keeps getting critiqued that, he's going to take away everybody's jobs. And the two of us were saying, why don't people want to give up their jobs? In other words, since when is unemployment a problem? Right? In itself, it's not, right? It's like, I don't need a job. I'll take money, food, meaningful work. I don't need a job. Fuck that. But our inability to imagine around that even, it sort of creates, so AI is a nightmare because it makes it so that none of us have to work. Wait a minute. What's the SolarPunk? Because SolarPunk, not all SolarPunk has to be low tech either. There could be AIs in SolarPunk. It's just like, so what's the happy? How did we implement it in a happy way? But maybe we should go back and look at, what was the genesis of SolarPunk, either in the world or for you?
The very first reference seems to have been a blog post by someone called the Republic of Bees in 2012. And she was basing I'm really tired of all this doom and gloom. And I was trying to feel what if there could be a steampunk or a cyberpunk, but that was for a sustainable and socially just future that we like to live in. And she illustrated with this image of how a cargo ship had been converted to be with a kite sail, pulling out in front of it, right? But what's great is in the next episode of SolarPunk Detective, the beginning, there's an action scene set on, one of these types of ships, which is partly sail powered, an adapted cargo ship, but a modern cargo ship, which is still metal. And these are actually all in design right now, and some are about to be deployed. Then in terms of the evolution of it, this Brazilian anthology came out. No, that came out in 2012. Republic of the Bees came out earlier, the post. And I don't know whether they read her blog or not or whatever, but they basically, they were doing a series of short story anthologies, these Brazilian publishers. And they had done one for steampunk, one for cyberpunk. And then they were let's have a more positive one. So they did a solarpunk one. And then it's really sort of grown very gradually from there. One of the major contributors is World Weaver Press, and particularly Serena Ulibarri, who she made these more anthologies of solarpunk fiction. And it's really started to just explode.
But on a certain level, even though it's very futuristic, wouldn't Star Trek count as solarpunk now? Because they were happy and there's no money and there's Klingons and stuff, but it's a utopian society they've built.
Oh, Doug, you're speaking to a hardcore Trekkie right here, my friend. I've got, I'm pretty much wearing my Captain Kirk boxer shorts right now, but actually, you can't see, but, so I think it's an excellent question because it goes back to this thing. So we recently released a deep dive saying what is solarpunk, one thing or many? And in that we argue that there's not one solarpunk. There are a number of different shades, and that the core that we think that all types of solarpunk to be solarpunk need to share are that they show a more sustainable world that's more socially just and that is inspiring enough that it makes you want to take action to make it happen. It's not just a purely fantasy aesthetic. And within the shades, we do one of those sort of XY graphs, and there's basically more rooted solarpunk, which we would describe as being it's nearer future. The technology is not that fantastical. So Star Trek, it's you've got transporters, replicators, that sort of thing.
Right. But it could be more they've got biodiesel and local currency and solar panels. And it's we could just use the shit that we already have and be nice to each other. And we're 9/10 of the way to the solarpunk future.
Yeah. For us at SolarPunk Stories, that our shade is much more rooted. And it's and overwhelmingly what features in the stories is technology that's already existing. Maybe it's not being used as widely. So you could argue that Star Trek is solarpunk. It's a much more fantastical shade.
Gotcha.
But for me personally, and this is obviously just my personal opinion, but also for the rest of our squad of volunteers who do SolarPunk Stories, it's not as valuable in terms of inspiring people to take action now. So while Star Trek was very inspiring to people in the past, not least for how diverse it was at the time and other ways, I think part of the issue with Star Trek for us is that the idea is that the Federation has only come about because people invented like replicators, and only when we've made this sort of like magical super technology can we then have a more equal future.
Right. Once we get to warp drive capability, then we can join the League of Planets and be a good, happy, democratic place. But until warp, well, sorry, we can't.
It gives people a mental get out. Whereas for us, like I already said, I think we've already got all the technology that we need. I mean, more better technology, which is coming, will help it make things easier. But the biggest changes that I think we need to make a deliciously sustainable world that's socially just and great groovy SolarPunk are the economic, cultural, and political changes. It's not about like, keeping our current economy, culture, and politics basically the same with really, we're like transporters. That's not that much better a world to me, like what. And so what we try to show in the background of the stories of, like, say, SolarPunk Detective is that that people are working like on average 21-hour working week. Like they've got, like you're saying, like cars are virtually unknown. Bicycles everywhere. But what we're trying to do, because the other part on our axis is from rooted to fantastical, but the other one is from thrilling to happy. And one of the big things we feel we're trying to add to, say, like the SolarPunk scene or movement is to do more thrilling stories, because even though in the original anthologies, like from Brazil, you did have like murder and even cannibals and stuff like that in those stories, a lot of the stories at the moment have been, not only is it a better future, but there's like no like serious conflict. It's basically like there might be conflict between characters, but it's more like unrequited love or stuff like that. And for me, when I first came up with the idea for SolarPunk stories after reading SolarPunk Detective, I was thinking, like, if it's a radically better future which is inspiringly more happy, where does the drama come? Where does the conflict come from? And that's where the idea of SolarPunk Detective came from, because he's one of the last murder detectives left in London. So there are far fewer murders, but there is still enough, even though he's only part-time. and so through that, and through the drama of like trying to solve and the mystery and the murder, you're carried through the story wanting to solve that murder mystery, but then you get in the rest of the world too. Whereas some of the, in the happier types, it's maybe less thrilling. Yeah.
So I could do like SolarPunk Exorcist, right? It's a happy world, but every once in a while, there's still people get possessed, no matter how much alternative currency, there's still, in between spirits and stuff. It's like,
that's funny. I mean, what would he do? He'd have like specially like rainwater sourced like holy water or something like that. It'd be like that.
It's all friggin' all indigenous permaculture exorcism techniques, of course, with ethically produced soil that he sprinkles on people and stuff. No, it's interesting though. Those two axes are really interesting. So back to the original axis, and with all apologies to Sun Ra, I mean, space is not the place. Right? I mean, this is the beautiful thing, that the man who lived Star Trek, for a long time, when William Shatner went to space and he comes back and he says, it was among the strongest feelings of grief I have ever encountered. That's what he said on Seek Space. The contrast between the vicious coldness of space and the warm nurturing of Earth below filled me with overwhelming sadness. Every day we are confronted with the knowledge of further destruction of Earth at our hands, the extinction of animal species, of flora, of fauna, things that took 5 billion years to evolve, and suddenly we will never see them again because of the interference of mankind. It filled me with dread. My trip to space was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it felt like a funeral. But the answer to that then is like, okay, it felt like a funeral, but it was not a funeral. It was a wake-up call to something else. So what do we do instead? Instead of celebrating space out there or some distant 7th century forward future after we make it through something, how do we celebrate 10 years from now? How do we celebrate 5 years from now? What would that look like? What's the happiest 5 years from now you can imagine? And how do we work toward that? I mean, is such a more constructively positive fictional experiment.
Yeah, and I think like so there we call that sort of shade of like 5 years from now, like now solar, because it's like so close that like, you know, and there's a brilliant group called Commando Jugendstil who are actually like mainly Italian in spite of their name, and they've done these. They are not only do they had stories released which are set like could be set today about environmental activism, punking, like taking over a square in Milan with lots of people wearing like Lord of the Rings costumes and stuff like that, and like guerrilla gardening that square. But they also are like doing environmental action in their communities today, like as well. And that's another part of like the SolarPunk movement. And in fact, there's many people who identify as SolarPunk who have never read any SolarPunk stories and have never like, you know, and they've almost certainly seen some of the artwork online. But I think when it comes back to the fiction, there is a challenge though, which is that I think that, and it's a challenge that we find when, you know, we're trying to write and edit the stories, is having it close enough that it seems like, yeah, we can make this happen. This could happen within our, you know, like with our lifetimes. Let's make this happen. But sort of far enough ahead that it can really radically be better while still being credible. So if you know, like you know, it's like what's like the best possible future you can imagine in 5 years' time. Like, you know, within reason, it's like, you know, yeah, it could be a lot better, but like, and so this is why, you know, the SolarPunk Detective series, and the whole idea is we're planning it to be a whole series of stories, is the first episode is in 2066, because that was sort of like, we were like, when's the soonest we could have, you know, like a 21-hour working week? Even then, that might be an upbeat assessment. That might be that might be a, you know, overly optimistic. But I think what's good is that there's definitely place as well to have further future stories, but not for us as high tech and as far in the future Star Trek.
Well, what about though? I mean, my impulse, I mean, in the story that I've started on is kind of I don't want to call it post-apocalyptic future, but post-event future. In other words, that the baddish thing happens, but then we move into a kind of more of a Station 11 interesting kibbutz-like, you know, we work it out, you know, in certain ways. So it's a compromise, I guess, between apocalypse fiction and solarpunk fiction, where it's like, yeah, the bad thing kind of happens, but it's not quite as bad as we imagine it, and there's another side to it. I mean, does that count as solarpunk?
There was a conference a few years ago, which we've got some videos to it on our website, and someone who's done a lot of these visioning exercises with people about like trying to envision like, you know, solarpunk style futures. She said that, but almost none of them could envisage getting to that future without first there being like some terrible setbacks, like some sort of, yeah, like you're saying, like some sort of apocalypse or terrible event. And he said, you know, that's not good. Like we need to try and if we think that the only way we can make the future happen is if we go first through, you know, we have to go first through this like terrible apocalypse to then rebuild the world anew.
Right. Because, yeah, I guess we don't want people to think, okay, we're going to have to, because it gets very Steve Bannon eventually. Oh, we have to tear down the system, go through an apocalyptic event, then go through our warlords, you know, with, you know, running around with Humvees and machine guns until eventually we get more of an Ocean's 11 traveling theater troops love fest, right? It's like, that's not, so... So I do see the problem with that. In other words, with assuming there's apocalypse, then what? I vote for an apocalypse, for an afterworld that doesn't look like a zombie apocalypse, but looks like, I see the problem with that. Then the other thing I'm thinking a lot about is the other axis you're talking about, the thrilling to happy that I want to make. Okay, it's a SolarPunk universe. So my SolarPunk universe is one that sort of, there's been a technological collapse, and that's allowed for enchantment. Right. So the world gets magical again because, the fairies basically come back because they're just not here because there's too much cell phone interference and shit. Right. Don't laugh. It's true. They're not extinct yet. They're not.
Those photos were faked, Doug. Those photos were faked.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Exactly. They're here. I believe they're here. They're still among us. They're just very quiet. But that the enchantment of our reality is very hard to experience with this much noise. You can't even see the stars, right? So it's hard to see, the trees as alive and what's really going on here. But anyway, so I was thinking about that and then thinking, well, I've got to have conflict. So there's going to be an invader. There'll be an intruder. There'll be a this. And then I started to think, well, what if in a SolarPunk future, the only reason we see the invader or as bad or as conflict is because of our own traumatic memory. In other words, we remember the world that we're in now. So of course we're going to see something as an invader, even when it's not. So that the conflict in a SolarPunk world, it would be a fun lesson anyway. The conflict is always self-generated perceptual horror, not actual horror. It's like, oh, you're seeing it as aliens from another dimension, and it's not. It's little friends coming to visit,
Yeah, I mean, I've got to make super clear here that I think that, there's a place for many different shades, right? And effectively,
right.
And ultimately those who want to write more happy solar stories where there's, no action or violence or thrills in those ways, it's all power to them, completely. But
that can work.
Yeah.
And can that work as an entertainment fiction?
Well, that's a big question, right? I mean, I think the thing for I think the thing for us, we're trying to make a more thrilling type of SolarPunk stories that will just basically be easier for people who are not already signed up. Philip K. Dick was writing science fiction that the factory worker could read on his way home on the streetcar when those still existed, tired at the end of his shift. And I think it is a bit of a, I think that's the challenge. I also think, just to be really honest, that, some people cite the stories, it's some other people in the SolarPunk scene say all of the stories need to be happy. There must be no conflict in them. That's against our thing. Right. And then
it's a religion. Yeah.
Yeah, but the point is that it's hard to say how many of them go home at the end of a hard day and read those stories, but also the references to books like The Dispossessed. So you could say by Ursula K. Le Guin, if that's sort of a sort of proto SolarPunk story, even though it's set in space and there's rocket stuff, but it's her depiction of an anarchist utopia, and then her character goes to the other planet, which is a more sort of social democratic one. But Ursula K. Le Guin was an amazingly good writer. She was just it is a phenomenally well-written book.
Yeah. And she was also dealing with kind of post-duality on all levels as well. She was, philosophically pushing the vision of what humans could be to another place.
But my point about the writing is that I think it's so much harder because a lot of the other utopian fiction besides her that I've read, The Island by Aldous Huxley or News from Nowhere by William Morris, are so boring. I mean, they're almost painful to read, and it's almost just here is a walkthrough. And I'm glad to say a lot of the happy shade of SolarPunk fiction is much better than what they wrote. It's much more entertaining, but it puts a bit of pressure on you that for us as well, to make especially short stories really engaging, something that someone will come to who's like not familiar with the scene but get them excited into it. That's it. The only other thing is that in the Dispossessed, there is actually violence as well. It actually opens in the first few pages with someone throwing a rock at the head of the protagonist. And there's a spoiler alert, there's a terrible massacre towards the end. Like a whole group of people get gunned down by the army. So even that doesn't, even from the master, there was still violence and conflict in there as well. Yeah. Sorry, Doug, you go.
I was going to say it's almost more appropriate for, like, I remember when I first got my PlayStation and I had Mario World on there. And I would like, to rather than to get through the level, I would explore the level. What is there here? Because there's all these little nooks and crannies and mushrooms and things and stuff you can walk around, and it's almost the non-conflictual SolarPunk future may in some cases be better for a different medium than linear storytelling. Not to get into like visions of Web3 or some friggin' thing like that, but maybe, some VR, AR exploratory thing or fantasy role playing where it doesn't have to be, we're so addicted to conflict-based story, and it doesn't necessarily have to be. It could be more, like an English muffin. You're just going through nooks and crannies, textural wonder, right?
Being British, I don't actually know what an English muffin is. What is it? Is that like
it's like a toasted thing? It's a little toasted thing. It's you put it in a toaster and it has lots of little holes. So there's like dark parts and light parts. It's a textural toast experience.
No, I think that's you had a really, really brilliant point there as well, because I think that a medium allows for the story as well. Because there's another thing as well where there's a number of people in the scene, who say you cannot have single protagonist led stories because we're like a collective movement and it needs to be multiple protagonists. But again, in the short story form, it's very tough. It's very tough. And like in a TV series, brilliant. You got the space to like really develop and expand on a lot of characters and stuff like The Wire or something like that, And that would be amazing to see like a sort of SolarPunk Wire one day. But I think it's mainly about people not putting too much pressure on themselves to make the art be in a certain way, like to be too strictly adhere to what they feel like the correct art should be, and to go with, what their sentiment is. And so I think that that's the main thing. And to have a diversity. And I think this was the main reason why we wrote this article about the many shades, was really because we just kept seeing on these forums and also in these events, people saying like, we cannot define what SolarPunk is, but it's definitely not what that guy likes. That guy likes is eco-fascism. Well, that guy... Right. And the question is that, some things are greenwash. Some things we would say are not SolarPunk that get labeled as it. But to try and have, a definition that, was coherent enough that people could find more SolarPunk if they like it, build the movement to inspire the change, but also like loose enough that it allowed for these different shades. So if you're more into like tech, that doesn't mean you're not SolarPunk, just means that you're just a different shade of it, and that type of thing. So I think, there's space there. But one thing was interesting, your thing about the fairies and the magic, I think that would technically, that's probably more lunar punk, which is I don't know if you come across that.
No.
Yeah. So there's debates now, it's like even newer than SolarPunk, but there's debates about whether or not it is a subgenre of SolarPunk or whether it's an entirely new genre. But one of the main things that distinguishes it from SolarPunk is that it's more open to like magic and supernatural forces being like real and present in there, which
as if magic were part of fantasy, right? which most people seem to think it is. But yeah, I was even, and just last week, I was speaking to the guy who came up with the term mycopunk, which is, mycelia-based solar punk. So it's another subgenre. They're declaring themselves part of the SolarPunk universe, but it's a nice one, And there's examples. I mean, Star Trek had a mycelial network. That what was it? Captain Stamets was named after the mushroom explorer. An interesting place to play with it too. But yeah, it's interesting. It's also, imagining a world where things have worked out, where we figure things out, and imagining a successful form of story that's not necessarily based in conflict are similar thought experiments in some ways. I'm not saying that stories can't have conflict, and have a happy world. There's always going to be something, those bugs or something that we got to deal with. But it's interesting that and finally, I think it comes down to what works under capitalism. Does SolarPunk work under capitalism as well as zombies eating your face? Is there a reason the first sort of, mycopunk style science fiction show, This Last of Us, the mushrooms are the friggin' enemy? They're the enemy? The mushrooms are not the enemy. I hate that, right? I mean, it's a cool show, but I don't like that the mushrooms are the enemy, infecting people and taking them over. They're our friends.
I mean, look, I had some mushrooms at lunch. I feel that exactly. I love them so much. I want them in my body, but no, I think the other thing, to go back to this point about the conflict, is that, when someone commented on one of our Instagram posts, but there should be no murder in a SolarPunk future. It can't be SolarPunk if there are still murders. And for us, the thing is that, so in the SolarPunked London, where Detective Inspector Russo, is on the case, murders are far fewer, for starters. But the point is to say, like, a future with no murder. Well, the main sci-fi that comes to mind of that is Minority Report, and that for me is not like a happy future, right? And there's things where it's like, even in a radically better future, we are still humans. There are still people, and we still have, a part, I think, of the mix of our experience is that we have dark desires as conflicts, but there is also the idea, like in Star Trek, where does the drama come from in Star Trek? Yes, there's conflict between characters, not mainly not violent, but there's also conflict with the sort of non-Federation, races who are like, and particularly what I love is like in Deep Space Nine, and obviously the Ferengi, who are like ultra capitalist. They're like these like ultra, like they're obsessed with money. And I think, and it's a similar thing, like to say that again, like, especially if we want to portray a world that is not just this post-apocalyptic, people making their like, whatever, like cooperative gardens in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. If we want to show a world where, there's much of like the benefits of our civilization right now are still there, if not enhanced, but maybe not the whole world is like that. And so in the Russoverse, we have it where the future America is a sort of crypto-fascistic, like, military government. And in the second episode of SolarPunk Detective, it's actually a refugee who's been in the American military. She's on the boat with the kite sail that sinks off the coast of Britain, and she ends up there as a climate refugee, as like a reset. And what's good then is that she's able to introduce the readers to the world through the eyes of someone who's come from a society which is still in many ways quite similar to ours. And then she gets introduced to this other, more SolarPunk British Republic of the future.
Right. But the idea that a workable SolarPunk future is dependent on us absolving ourselves of interhuman conflict is problematic in itself. You know what I mean? The enlightenment is not a prerequisite for happy survival, right? So I like the idea, like, let's solve a little problem like climate change and then start worrying about big ones, like the fact that we don't like each other,
And also, we don't like each other, but I think, that's you very well put, Doug. But I think even for me, in the best possible future, people are still gonna bitch at each other, still gonna fight, and I think that's just part of how I feel it's part of the rich tapestry of who we are, and
it is exactly. But we don't have to take the whole friggin' planet and every other species down with us, right?
Amen. Amen.
Well, Alex, Holland, I love you. I'm so glad you're energetic and here. I didn't tell the story of your long COVID battle, but it's my heart goes out to you, and I'm so glad you got these wonderful bursts of happy energy, and hopefully they will begin to outnumber whatever the opposite might be in your constitutional journey.
Well, Doug, I mean, your work and Team Human have been such an inspiration to me and many of the other volunteers in the SolarPunk Story Squad. And we're also very eager and keen. We're always looking for other partners and collaborators to come and, join us and help make inspiring visions of the SolarPunk future so that we then go and make it a reality. And it's really kind of you to say that, you're right. Long COVID's been really tough. And I'm going to share some of that experience in an article coming up about how SolarPunk has saved my life. So yes. So bless you, Doug, and bless Team Human.
And bless you. And bless solarpunkstories.com, where you can go and see stories that you do not have to worry so much about. We can do this. We are doing this. The happy days are inevitable. So join us in them. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Doug.
And thank you for being on Team Human. Our guest today was Alex Holland, the founder of SolarPunk Stories. Team Human is produced by Joshua Chapdelaine and edited by Luke Robert Mason. I'm Douglas Rushkoff, and you've been on Team Human, our last best hope for peeps.